I started with scratch watercolor paper that I cut to uniform widths. I used the back of an X-Acto blade to score the center of the pages, which I then used to fold them easily onto themselves. I went back and forth between deciding what size of the pages I wanted to use for the project. I marked about 1/2 inch from each side for the end hole placements. I marked the center where I'll be placing the band, and I marked a little bit to the sides of where the end band will be, erasing the center. The first marks are a bit uneven, which is why I then switched to a thinner pencil. I then punched the holes using an awl, holding the paper slightly above the mat to allow for easier hole punching. Of course, I was careful with my finger placements here. What I ended up doing later is using a thick piece of mat board to place under the paper, allowing me to punch the holes much faster, rather than the process here where I kind of had to worry about the height of the paper and my finger placement. After threading the needle, I placed the needle through the thread and then pulled to create a knot, which you can very easily undo. I leave a bit of thread hanging from the first hole. I loop it through the 2 center holes and then out through the last. I then place a piece of linen tape through the first loop, leaving a bit of excess at the bottom. I continue the threading right above the last hole and repeat the process in reverse, making sure to thread over the linen tape. I then created 2 knots by placing the excess thread above and pulling above, and then placing it below and pulling below. I learned a lot from this process since it was my first bookbind. For my second project, I ended up using a clip to hold the pages together. Beginning with the 3rd page, I looped the needle between the 2 pages below, and then threaded the needle through the hole, pulling up to tighten, and continuing the process. Continuing with these knots on both sides for any subsequent pages. Pull thread horizontally to tighten, but not enough so that you cannot adjust the linen tape as needed. I made sure to add a knot between the last 2 pages as well. I measured the spine and cut a piece of cloth to the length, leaving some excess for the top and bottom of the width. I currently don't have a book press, so I use this flower press to place the paper block for adding the glue. If you do not have either, I have used books with clamps or 1/4 inch chipboard with clamps. I added archival PVA glue to the spine, making sure to avoid the top and bottoms. After first spreading the glue, I then used pouncing motions to work the glue into the crevices, especially in the thread areas. Note the glassing paper to protect the flower boards from the glue. I placed the first piece of cloth, pressing down with my brush and adding a bit more glue to ensure it adheres properly. I then added the second cloth, repeating the process. I let this first layer dry, then added a second layer. I let the paper block dry for 24 hours before proceeding to the next step. I cut a 1/4 inch wide piece of chipboard that I'll be using as a spacer. I will be cutting chipboards the width of the text block, adding 1/8 inch to the top and to the bottom. I did need to make several passes with my blade to cut through the chipboard. Using one of the covers as a template, I cut the spine to its width and to the height of the front and back covers. I place a piece of ribbon about halfway down the text block spine, place it through the text block, and cut where I want it to end. I cut a piece of cloth that accounts for the entire width of all the chipboard, adding 1/4 inch measurement between each cover and the spine, as well as 1 inch to both front and back covers. The height measurement is the height of all chipboard plus about 1 inch to the top and bottom. I cut a strip of book cloth the width of the spine. I cut pieces of thread slightly smaller than the width of the spine, add glue to the center, fold them over, and create the headbands. I add glue about halfway down the spine and the width of the ribbon. I make sure to press down firmly to assure it adheres. I then add more glue to the ribbon. I follow by adding glue to the headband. I first decide the placement, then I press down. I add additional glue to the top and bottom of the headbands as well as the ribbon. Here I'm adding glue to adhere the linen tape, followed by glue to adhere both of the cheesecloths on both sides. I roughly place all the chipboard on the cloth. This is slightly thick imitation leather. I then use a previously cut spacer to ensure the proper distance between the spine and each cover. I add a generous amount of glue to the first chipboard, then place onto the cloth. I follow the process with the spine and the other chipboard, using the spacer to ensure the proper distance and using a ruler to ensure they are lined up properly. I cut the edges of the cloth, leaving a bit of space at the corners. For this thicker piece of material, I add glue to both the cloth itself as well as to the chipboard. I then fold the cloth onto the glue and use clamps to keep it in place. This isn't necessary for all book cloth, just for this one as it's slightly thick. I had a bit of trouble with the edges, so I added a little bit more glue there as well as moved the clamps closer to the edges. This is a cloth about 1 millimeter thick, and it didn't take long for the glue to set. By the time I was done with the last portion, the other sections had already set. I let the last glue portion set about 15 minutes before removing all of the clips. I placed the elastic band about halfway down the back spine, measuring roughly where the pages will land to make sure that the band was completely covered. I then placed the band how it would sit, measuring the point where it sat at the back cover, and cut. I placed a generous amount of glue on the band, placed it at the back cover, adding glue to the last page, followed by pressing it onto the back cover. What I would have done in hindsight is place the text block vertically onto the spine and bring the paper to each cover rather than bring the cover to the paper, as I'm doing kind of blindly at this point. I then removed part of the last page I had just glued, placed the elastic band where it would sit in its final position, added a bit more glue, and pressed it back down. In hindsight here as well, what I would have done different is mark where each band sits, add glue to those portions in the bands, and just glue it there the first time with the last page, versus going through a bit of a complicated process as I did here. I put my finished book in the flower press for 24 hours before removing it. I learned a lot from this, my first bookbinding. I definitely could have done a few things differently, such as putting glue or something at the end of that ribbon to keep it from fraying, as well as doing the elastic band a bit differently, but overall, I think that I'm pretty satisfied with how it turned out. Thank you for watching.